interesting to hear Lee and Christine speak to us, of course. And I think the real hope is the connections that we have with each other. I was sharing a steak with Lee at the Breakfast Creek Hotel today, and I hadn't done that since I was a university student here in the early 1970s. And I turn up here and here with Paul Wilson. We were involved in Owen Peters' case here in Queensland back in 1981. Margaret Broadnight and I, we appeared together at the Port Fairy Folk Festival some years ago. I hasten to add I wasn't singing. Camilla and I worked on campaigns to do with WIC and refugees. So there are many points of connection, and I think we have to pursue those points of connection in trust and in hope in the weeks and the months that are ahead. And of course, I'm delighted to accept this invitation to stand here tonight in solidarity with you, Christine and Lee. We come trying to save the life of your son, our fellow Australian, Scott Rush. Let me begin with a significant event 40 years ago in my own life when I was a schoolboy. I was 12 years old, having just been promoted to the large dining room at my country boarding school at Downlands College, Toowoomba. It was the 3rd of February 1967. Breakfast started punctually at 7:45 a.m. The din of 300 boys at table was always deafening once the supervising priest declared Deo Gratias. For the first and only time in my 5 years at that school, a handful of senior boys called for a minute's silence at 8 a.m. to mark the hanging of Ronald Ryan in Melbourne jail. As Ryan dropped, you could hear a pin drop in faraway Toowoomba. The recollection still brings me goosebumps. This was wrong. It should never happen again. How could a nation do this? All Australian jurisdictions then abolished the death penalty. The ambivalence of many Australians about the imposition of the death penalty on someone like Saddam Hussein shows just how infected we are by consequentialist reasoning about moral questions. The practical, hands-on Aussie approach often plays fast and loose with moral reasoning about what is right and wrong. We think it's wrong for foreign states to impose the death penalty on Aussie drug traffickers and drug mules, but we apply different reasoning to non-Australians facing death at the hands of the state. Sure, Saddam Hussein was a murderous thug. The death penalty is either right or wrong. Could innocent human lives be effectively defended in Iraq by keeping Hussein in prison rather than killing him? If so, it was wrong to kill him, no matter what positive political consequences apologists thought might come from the execution, whether televised or not. It's very regrettable that Alexander Downer, the Australian Foreign Minister, claimed that Saddam's death marks an important step in consigning his tyrannical regime to the judgment of history and pursuing a process of reconciliation now and in the future. The televised images of his death did undermine such reconciliation. The execution was wrong, regardless of its consequences. It's time that we Australians presented a coherent, unified voice to the world. We are opposed to the death penalty, and not just when it is our own boys and girls on death row. We think the death penalty is barbaric, whether the criminal is a Bali bomber, or a drug mule. If it's to be imposed, it should be imposed only for the very worst of offences, and only where there is no alternative for the protection of the innocent. Dr. Michael Fullilove, Director of the Global Issues Program of the Lowy Institute for International Policy, and therefore not a trendy do-gooder or lefty, has put 2 suggestions for Australian politicians of all hues to accelerate our efforts at abolishing the death penalty. On the cusp of an election, I commend these suggestions to all voters and candidates. This is what Fullilove has written. First, Our leaders should be consistent in their comments on the death penalty. It's difficult to discern such consistency at the moment. For example, Prime Minister John Howard said he would welcome the execution of Osama bin Laden, and former Labour leader Mark Latham said Amrozi's sentencing to death was a cause for celebration. These kinds of comments erode the abolitionist underpinnings of our position and make us look hypocritical when we ask for Australians to be spared. Second, Australia should initiate a regional coalition against the death penalty. Asia is world's best practice when it comes to executing people. 15 Asian states retain the death penalty for ordinary crimes. Methods of execution include hanging, shooting by firing squad, or with a single bullet to the back of the head and lethal injection. China and Singapore are particularly notable. China carried out more than 80% of the known executions last year, and in the period 1999 to 2003, Singapore boasted the highest per capita execution rate in the world. I am one of those Australians, one of those voters, who is delighted that Robert McClelland, the shadow foreign minister, last night came out and pledged a future Labor government both to a consistent stand on the death penalty, regardless of the nationality of the accused, and to a regional coalition in our region of those countries opposed to the death penalty, including Cambodia, Nepal, Bhutan, Timor-Leste and the Philippines. Both initiatives deserve to win bipartisan support. Both initiatives deserve open air support from anyone wanting to be Prime Minister of this country. In passing, I note that there's been significant development in the teaching of my own church on the death penalty. Despite the enthusiasm of some conservative and influential Catholics in the United States, Pope John Paul II, before his death, approved changes to the Catholic Catechism, stating, "Assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against an unjust aggressor. If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person." Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime, the Pope said, by rendering one who has committed an offence incapable of doing harm, without definitely taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. This principled stance should have broad appeal in our society, and not just to Catholics, not just to Christians. No one is seriously suggesting that Scott Rush or any member of the Bali Nine need to be killed in order to defend others from them. The pragmatic consequentialist ethic in contemporary Australia has long wreaked havoc on outsiders not meriting our respect, but now it's turning on us. We are losing respect even for ourselves. Take the situation of parents who at the last minute feel helpless that their son or daughter may be caught in a drug ring operating out of Indonesia. They or an intermediary contact the Australian Federal Police and seek assistance, wanting their child stopped at the airport or at least given a warning. We now know that the Australian Federal Police are instructed to cooperate with the Indonesian police up until the time that charges are laid, even if there be a real risk that the death penalty will be imposed. Being a civil law country and not a common law country like Australia, Indonesia does not lay charges until the end of the investigation process. In common law countries like Australia, charges are laid much earlier in the investigation and prosecution process. If Indonesia were a common law country like Australia, the AFP would be much more restricted in their capacity to cooperate with the Indonesian police when an Australian citizen could be facing death.